Chapter 1. Shadows over Salem. The air in Salem village was bitter with the cold of a long Massachusetts winter, but it was not just the chill of the wind that crept beneath the doors. There was something else, a creeping unease, a slow-burning dread that seemed to settle in the bones like frost. By 1692, Salem was a place of tension, a community that had been stretched taut by years of hardship, religious rigidity, and fear of the unknown. To live in Salem was to live under constant watch, not just by neighbors, but by God, the devil, and a ceaselessly judging eye that belonged to the very culture they'd constructed. The village itself was little more than a scattering of timber-framed houses, clustered tightly along dirt roads that quickly turned to mud in the rain and froze hard as iron in winter. Smoke from hearth fires curled upward into gray skies, and children trudged along narrow paths in woolen cloaks, heads bowed against the wind. Livestock huddled in crude barns. The forest loomed just beyond the cleared fields, dense, dark, and teeming with mystery. To the Puritans, the woods were not just wilderness. They were chaos, the devil's playground, and perhaps even his home. Salem was divided, both literally and figuratively. There was Salem town, a bustling port 5 miles to the south, and Salem village, the agrarian outpost home to the families who wanted separation, who resented the increasing commerce and moral laxity of the town. The village had fought long and hard to establish its own church, a symbol of independence, but also a fracture point. With independence came conflict, disputes over land, taxes, ministerial support. Beneath the surface of everyday life simmered old grudges and unresolved quarrels, a social powder keg waiting for a spark. The people of Salem were Puritans, heirs of a Calvinist theology that taught life was a battle between the forces of good and evil. To them, the world was a spiritual battlefield. God was sovereign but distant, and Satan was a real, active presence who sought to corrupt souls, especially the souls of the faithful. Every crop failure, every sick child, every misfortune could be a sign of God's disfavor. This was a world where invisible forces shaped visible outcomes, and where the devil didn't just tempt, he recruited. That belief made witches more than heretics. They were traitors in a cosmic war. A witch was not simply a person practicing superstition or folk magic. She was someone who had made a pact with the devil. And, if one witch could exist in a godly community like Salem, more surely followed. It was infection, not just crime. Contagion. The logic was airtight and terrifying. It is against this backdrop that the first signs of trouble began to emerge. Small at first, almost unremarkable. In January, just 9 years old, began to exhibit strange behaviors. She screamed without cause, threw things, contorted her body into unnatural positions, and claimed to feel pinches and pricks on her skin. Her cousin, Abigail Williams, 11, soon joined her. The household quickly became a chamber of confusion and fear. Reverend Parris was no stranger to conflict. A Harvard-educated minister, he was deeply conservative and had made more enemies than friends in Salem village since his arrival in 1689. His sermons were fierce, his calls for discipline rigid, and he expected full support, both spiritual and financial, from his congregation. But support was fractured. Many in the village had grown weary of ministerial disputes, having been through several failed tenures before Parris's arrival. Now, with strange behaviors in the parsonage, suspicion turned quickly to the supernatural. The diagnosis of witchcraft was not immediate. At first, local physicians, unable to find a medical explanation, suggested the cause might be beyond nature. The idea caught quickly. In a culture where spiritual warfare was a daily reality, the devil was always a suspect, and where there was the devil, there were witches. To understand how quickly and completely the panic took root, one must understand the mechanisms of fear in a closed society. Salem was not merely religious, it was insular. Outsiders were viewed with skepticism, and internal dissent was dangerous. The afflicted girls were young, but they were also central. Their behaviors, once accepted as genuine, could not be ignored. When questioned about the source of their torments, they began to name names. And so, the machinery of accusation began to grind into motion. Tituba, an enslaved woman from the Caribbean who lived in the Parris household, was one of the first accused. So too were Sarah Good, a destitute beggar, and Sarah Osborne, a woman who had defied the village's social norms. These were not powerful women. They were marginalized, easy targets, socially vulnerable. In that vulnerability lay the dark logic of the witch hunt. The weak were dangerous because they were weak. Their very isolation made them suspect. As word spread, the afflicted girls began to demonstrate more extreme symptoms: fits, trances, visions. The more they claimed to suffer, the more authority they were given. And with each accusation, the fear deepened. Who else might be hiding a secret alliance with Satan? Who might be next? In February and March of 1692, formal charges were brought. The examinations took place in public settings, and what followed was less about legal process and more about theatrical ordeal. Accusers wept, wailed, and convulsed. The accused, often confused and frightened, were forced to answer questions that presumed guilt. If they denied the charges, the girls cried out louder. If they confessed, they were spared, but only if they named others. This dynamic rewarded confession and punished defiance. It inverted justice, and it revealed something deeply unsettling about the nature of belief: that under the right conditions, certainty needs no evidence, only reinforcement. By spring, the village was consumed. More and more people were drawn into the dragnet. Entire families were accused. Lifelong neighbors turned on one another. The trials had not yet begun in full, but the groundwork was laid, and the emotional tempo was quickening. Ministers across the colony weighed in. Some warned against rushing to judgment. Others called for purification no matter the cost. In Salem village, trust collapsed. Mothers wept for their daughters. Husbands denounced their wives. Children testified against parents. The very fabric of community, already frayed, began to unravel completely, and the forest still loomed at the edge of the fields, dark and silent. This was Salem before the court of Oye and Termina convened, before the hangings, and the apologies, and the scars that would never heal. The trials had not yet begun, but already Salem was lost to fear. What began in whispers had become a roar, and so the circle widened. More accusations followed swiftly. Martha Corey, a full member of the church, and wife to Giles Corey, was an unexpected name, not a marginal figure, but a respected woman in the community. Her accusation rattled the faithful. If even church members could be witches, what boundaries remained? Martha had expressed skepticism about the girls' afflictions, and in a climate of growing fear, doubt was equated with guilt. During her examination, as she confidently declared her innocence, the afflicted girls performed with theatrical flair. They screamed that Martha Spector was biting them, clawing at their flesh, trying to silence them. The crowd watched as invisible battles played out in the minds and on the bodies of the afflicted. John Proctor, a farmer from outside the village, saw through the spectacle. His own servant, Mary Warren, had joined the group of afflicted girls. When she began exhibiting signs of bewitchment, Proctor beat her and threatened to whip the devil out of her. For a time, it worked. Mary ceased her accusations, but as pressure mounted, she relapsed, and eventually, Proctor himself was accused. The noose tightened around dissent. Accusations began to jump geographic boundaries. Towns like Ipswich, Andover, and Topsfield found themselves drawn into the chaos. Ministers and magistrates across the region watched uneasily as the scope of the crisis grew. The afflicted girls' visions became more elaborate, their torments more severe. The accused became more prominent. Not only vagrants and outcasts, but landowners, churchgoers, and public officials. In April, Reverend George Burroughs was arrested. He had once been a minister in Salem Village, but left under strained circumstances. The fact that he was living in Maine did not shield him from the finger of suspicion. He was accused of being the witch's ringleader, the very agent of Satan himself. The accusations against Burroughs were extraordinary: that he performed feats of supernatural strength, that he led secret rituals, that he communed with spirits and devils. When he was brought back to Massachusetts, he was shackled and paraded through the towns as proof that evil had indeed walked among them, not in shadows, but in pulpits. The legal machinery now ground into full motion. The colony's governor, Sir William Phipps, had arrived from England in May. Under pressure to address the growing crisis, he established a special court, the Court of Ogier and Termina, to hear the cases of witchcraft. The name meant to hear and determine, but in truth, the court served more to affirm and condemn. The rules of evidence were unlike anything seen in modern jurisprudence. Chief among the peculiarities was the admissibility of spectral evidence, testimony that a person's spirit or spectre had afflicted someone, even if their physical body was elsewhere. It was a concept rooted in deeply held belief, but utterly impossible to disprove. If a girl claimed that your ghost choked her in her sleep, how could you prove otherwise? This type of evidence became the linchpin of the trials. Alongside it came touch tests, where the afflicted were calmed by physical contact with the accused. There were also searches for witch marks, moles, birthmarks, or scars interpreted as signs of a pact with the devil. The mere presence of such a mark was damning. The absence of one only increased suspicion. In this legal environment, the path to salvation lay not in innocence, but in confession. Those who admitted guilt and implicated others were spared the gallows. Those who maintained their innocence faced the rope. By the early summer of 1692, the jails were overflowing. Over 150 people had been accused. Some were children, others were elderly. Husbands and wives were imprisoned together or apart. Infants were born and died in jail. The colony, already strained by war on the northern frontier and economic hardship, found itself consumed by internal terror. On June 2nd, the Court of Ogia and Termina held its first session. The accused was Bridget Bishop, a twice-widowed tavern owner with a reputation for colorful dress and sharp words. She had been accused of witchcraft years before, though acquitted. This time, the mood was different. Witnesses claimed she bewitched pigs. Others said she appeared in their dreams, whispering curses. The afflicted girls screamed when she looked at them. Her guilt, in the eyes of the court, was she was found guilty and sentenced to death. On June 10th, she was hanged on what would come to be called Gallows Hill. It was the first execution, but far from the last. The hanging of Bridget Bishop did not ease the village's unrest. Instead, it set a precedent. The machinery of death had been tested and found operational. Now, it would be employed with increasing frequency. Over the course of the summer, 30 and more people would be hanged, and one man pressed to death. Each name added to the execution roll deepened the scar on Salem's collective psyche. The next to be executed was Sarah Good. She had been one of the first accused. A homeless woman whose presence on the village roads made her a daily reminder of social disorder. Her trial had relied on flimsy evidence and the vivid testimonies of the afflicted girl. Her child, a 4-year-old daughter named Dorcas, had also been jailed and accused, her cries echoing in the prison as her mother went to the gallows. Sarah's final words were bitter. When she was told to confess and pray to save her soul, she spat out her defiance. "You're a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard. If you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." It was a chilling farewell, and one that would haunt some for years to come. Others followed her into death. Rebecca Nurse, a deeply religious and elderly woman, was hanged despite widespread belief in her innocence. Her case had initially ended in acquittal, but the verdict was not accepted. The court reconvened and reversed it. The Nurse family, who had long been respected in Salem, found themselves ostracized and shamed. The community's thirst for vengeance could no longer be constrained by rational doubt. Giles Corey, the husband of Martha Corey, suffered a different fate. When brought before the court, he refused to enter a plea. Without a plea, there could be no trial. Without a trial, the state could not legally confiscate his property. Determined to extract a confession, the authorities subjected him to a gruesome method of coercion. Over the course of 2 days, Giles was stripped, laid on the ground, and a wooden board was placed over his chest. Stones were piled on the board, one after another, while officials repeatedly demanded he enter a plea. His only reply, each time, was, "More weight." He died without ever uttering a confession. The use of torture, and the dignity with which Giles met it, became a whispered legend. Even as the trials continued to expand, the executions moved forward with mechanical precision. The court operated under a cloud of righteousness. To question its authority was to question the divine mandate of the colony. As the summer turned to fall, Salem was no longer a village in crisis. It was a village in full collapse. As the summer turned to fall, Salem was no longer a village in crisis. It was a village in full collapse. By September, the sheer number of accusations had overwhelmed the local courts and jails. Hundreds sat imprisoned, not only in Salem but in neighboring towns. Families were devastated, farms abandoned, livelihoods destroyed, livestock wandered, crops withered in the fields. The witch trials had become not only a moral and judicial catastrophe, but an economic one. Still, the court pressed forward. On September 19th, Giles Corey was sentenced to death. 2 days later, on September 21st, the court sentenced 8 more to hang. On September 22nd, the largest mass execution of the crisis. Those 8 were led to Gallows Hill and executed. Among them were Mary Estee, Alice Parker, Ann Pudita, and Samuel Wardwell. Each was defiant. Each refused to confess. Mary Eastie's final petition to the court was especially haunting. She asked not for her own life, but that no innocent blood be shed. "It is no small thing," she wrote, "for me to appear against my own life. But, if it be possible no more innocent blood may be shed." Her words fell on deaf ears, but they would echo through history. And then, almost as quickly as it began, the tide turned. In October, Reverend Increase Mather, father of the influential Cotton Madar, and a man of immense theological authority, delivered a scathing critique of the court's use of spectral evidence. He declared that it was better for 10 witches to go free than for one innocent person to be condemned. His words carried weight, not only because of his standing but because of growing unease among the colony's leaders. Governor Phipps, newly returned from the frontier, was horrified by what he saw. His own wife had been named among the accused. He acted swiftly. The court of Auger and Termina was dissolved. A new court, the Superior Court of Judicature, was established in January 1693. Spectral evidence was no longer admissible. The new court brought a different tone. Most cases were dismissed. Of those convicted, many were put. The momentum had shifted, and the machinery of accusation began to sputter. Though some still languished in jail for months, the mass panic had passed. In total, more than 200 people had been accused. 19 were hanged. 1 was pressed to death. Several died in prison. The aftermath was not swift, nor was it clean. For years, Salem lived in the shadow of the trials. In 1697, the Massachusetts General Court declared a day of fasting, and some judges publicly confessed their guilt. 1. Samuel Sewall stood in his church as a confession was read aloud. He bowed his head, wept, and asked God's forgiveness. It was not until 1702 that the trials were officially declared unlawful, and it was not until 1711 that the colony passed a bill restoring the rights and good names of many of the accused and granted financial restitution to their heirs. But money could not undo the hang. Apologies could not erase the terror. The Salem Witch Trials remain one of the most haunting episodes in American history, not only for the suffering inflicted but for what they reveal about the human psyche. Fear, when paired with righteousness, becomes a potent weapon. Authority, when unchecked, becomes tyranny cloaked in law. And belief, when untethered from reason, can turn neighbor against neighbor until even the purest heart becomes suspect. In the end, Salem was not destroyed by witches. It was destroyed by itself. Chapter 3. Trials by Fire. The winter of 1692 had passed, but in Salem, no thaw came. What had begun with a handful of girls and a cloud of suspicion had grown into a judicial inferno. With the establishment of the Court of Oyar and the village transformed from a site of whispers into a full stage for moral reckoning. Every stone house, every wooden bench, every narrow path seemed infused with dread. The first formal court session began in early June, and it was unlike anything the colony had ever seen. The makeshift courtroom, often the meeting house, or a town hall, overflowed with spectators. Parents brought their children. Ministers sat shoulder to shoulder with farmers. Even those not directly involved came to witness the great purification of the community. The public thirsted for clarity, for justice, for spectacle. Presiding over the court was Chief Justice William St, a stern man whose sense of piety was rivaled only by his trust in the righteousness of the court's mission. Alongside him sat a panel of magistrates, some cautious, others eager, but all were swept up in the gravity of the moment. They were not just judging crime, they were judging sin. In this setting, the accused were little more than props in a grand drama. When brought in, often in shackles and gaunt from weeks in jail, they faced a barrage of accusations, not only from their neighbors but from the afflicted girls themselves. These girls had become central figures, revered, feared, and believed without question. Their cries were treated as sacred testimony. Their visions, gospel. Bridget Bishop's case, the first to be tried, set the template. She was not convicted because of a single piece of damning evidence, but through a tapestry of suspicion. Neighbors testified that she had quarreled with them, that their children sickened after seeing her, that objects moved in her presence. Most damning of all, the afflicted girls collapsed in spasms when she entered the room. They screamed that her specter tormented them from across the room, pinching their arms, choking their throats, whispering blasphemies into their ears. Stoughton allowed this testimony to stand. He believed that God would not permit the devil to assume the shape of an innocent person. To see a specter, then, was to see the guilty soul laid bare. When Bridget was convicted and hanged, the crowd did not mourn. They rejoiced. Salem, they believed, was one step closer to salvation. But the proceedings did not slow. In fact, they accelerated. One after another, the accused were paraded through the court. Some denied everything, clinging to innocence even as the court turned against them. Others confessed, their words often clearly coached, their stories echoing the language already established by earlier testimonies. The confessions became particularly troubling. Once someone confessed to being a witch, they were often spared, but only if they named others. The incentive structure of the trials encouraged betrayal. Friends turned on friends, children on parents, spouses on one another. A confession became both a shield and a weapon. Martha Carrier, a woman from Andover, was accused not only of witchcraft but of being a queen among witches. Her children were brought in and interrogated. Under duress, they claimed she had taken them to witches' meetings, that she had forced them to sign the devil's book. When Martha heard this, she stood, trembling, and cried out, "They are my children, and they would say anything to save themselves." Her cries were ignored. The court needed her guilt, and it was easily found. As the trials continued, the court's belief in the devil's direct influence hardened. The afflicted girls described in ever more vivid detail their spectral torment. They claimed to see witches flying overhead, to be pricked with pins, to be dragged through the air. The more they said, the more they were believed. But beneath the surface, cracks began to form. Ministers and citizens alike started to whisper that things had gone too far, that something darker than witchcraft was at play, that the court had created its own hysteria. Still Stoughton and others remained resolute. Each conviction seemed only to justify the next. Each hanging confirmed the court's purpose. Public sentiment, however, was starting to shift. A handful of respected citizens began to speak out, cautiously at first. Reverend John Wise of Ip raised questions about the legality of the trials and the moral danger of relying on spectral evidence. Thomas Brattle, a well-known merchant and intellectual, wrote a scathing letter condemning the process and warning that innocent lives were being destroyed. Meanwhile, those imprisoned began to organize. Letters smuggled from jail begged the outside world for justice. Some used scripture to argue their innocence. Others relied on appeals to reason, pleading with relatives and church members to see past the frenzy. There were voices crying out from within a storm. By August, even Cotton Mather, once a vocal supporter of the trials, began to urge caution. While he still believed in the reality of witchcraft, he expressed concern over the reliability of the evidence being accepted. He suggested that the devil could deceive, that perhaps innocent people were being harmed in the pursuit of righteousness. But by then, the court had already condemned more than a dozen people to death, and the machinery of justice was difficult to stop. Some victims still hoped that the truth would eventually prevail. Elizabeth Proctor, wife of John Proctor, was one of the most prominent figures still imprisoned. Though convicted, she was pregnant, and the court stayed her execution until after the child's birth. Her husband John, however, was not spared. A vocal critic of the trials, John Proctor had openly challenged the legitimacy of spectral evidence and the behavior of the afflicted girls. His boldness made him a target, and his fate was sealed. In jail, he drafted petitions, gathered support, and even managed to secure signatures from friends and neighbors attesting to his good character. It was a rare attempt at community pushback against the wave of accusations. But in the court's eyes, Proctor's resistance was a further mark of guilt. When he was led to the gallows in August 1692, he did not waver. Like others before him, he died proclaiming his innocence. The story of John and Elizabeth Proctor would resonate long after the trials ended. Their ordeal represented not only the tragedy of injustice, but the failure of society to protect even its most upright citizens. The scale of the crisis was by now undeniable. As more respected members of the community were accused, people began to question the legitimacy of the trials more openly. In Andover, nearly 40 people were arrested, prompting local outrage. Some citizens there refused to cooperate with the authorities. A few jurors even recanted their verdicts, claiming they had been pressured or misled. And still, the girls continued to perform. During the examinations, their fits became more grotesque. They writhed, foamed at the mouth, shrieked, and fainted. Some claimed to see monstrous animals in the courtroom. Others pointed to invisible wounds and bruises. But the consistency of their symptoms began to falter. The accusations became harder to follow, more fantastical, and less grounded in the known world. People noticed. One of the most infamous episodes during this time was the accusation against Reverend George Burke. Once a minister in Salem Village, Burroughs had moved to the main frontier, but was hauled back to stand trial. He was accused of being the leader of the witches, the mastermind behind the evil afflicting Salem. The girls claimed he possessed superhuman strength, that he summoned ghosts, and that he led black masses in the woods. Burroughs maintained his innocence to the very end. On the scaffold, moments before his execution, he recited the Lord's Prayer flawlessly, something witches were supposedly unable to do. His execution stunned many. Some in the crowd wept openly. It was perhaps the first public sign that the spell of the trials was beginning to break. Yet Stoughton and others refused to pause. They doubled down. If anything, they saw the growing resistance as further proof of diabolical interference. To them, the devil was now fighting back, not with violence, but with doubt. At the same time, the political context began to shift. Governor William Phips returned from fighting in the north and was appalled by what he found in his colony. He had initially supported the creation of the court but had been largely absent during its worst months. Now, with his own wife being named as a possible witch, Phips realized the trials had spiraled out of control. In October 1692, he ordered the Court of Oger and Termina dissolved. This move marked the beginning of the end, though the damage had already been done. With the court disbanded, a new tribunal was formed, the Superior Court of Judicature, which excluded spectral evidence from its proceedings. As a result, many remaining prisoners were released, charges dropped, and cases dismissed. The hysteria lost its legal foundation, and with it, its momentum. But the aftermath was long and painful. Families were left grieving, properties had been seized, the reputations of the dead were tarnished, and worst of all, the sense of collective guilt hung over the region like a fog. In the months that followed the dissolution of the court, a tentative quiet returned to the village. But it was not peace. It was the kind of silence that follows a storm. Heavy, wet, and full of debris. Salem had survived, but not without deep wounds. In early 1693, the new court began reviewing the remaining cases. Without spectral evidence to rely on, the charges became harder to prosecute. Juries were more skeptical, and judges less inclined to accept accusations at face value. Of the 50-odd people still awaiting trial, the vast majority were acquitted or released. A few lingered in jail for months longer, unable to pay the fees associated with their confinement. Others, though cleared of charges, returned to homes that had been burned, farms that had gone to seed, and communities that no longer trusted them. It was a time of reckoning, but not the kind that brought justice, rather, the kind that forces a society to stare into a mirror it had long avoided. What had happened in Salem could no longer be blamed on a few hysterical girls, or even on misguided judges. It was a collective failing of leadership, of faith, and of courage. Ministers who had once stood behind the trials now began to question them. In January 1697, a public day of fasting and repentance was declared throughout mass churches filled with solemn faces. Prayers were offered, confessions were made. Reverend Samuel Paris, whose own household had birthed the crisis, stood before his congregation and offered a half-hearted apology. It was not enough. By 1699, he had been forced to resign. Samuel Sewell, one of the judges on the court of Oger and Termina, went further. He stood in Boston's South Church, bowed his head as a confession was read aloud, and accepted full responsibility for his role in the trials. His humility set him apart. He would spend the rest of his life working to atone. But others remained unrepentant. Chief Justice William Stoughton, never once expressing doubt or remorse, continued to hold high office. He died in 1701, his reputation intact among those who still believed that the devil had indeed stalked New England. Among the most difficult tasks was restoring the reputations of the dead. In 1711, nearly 2 decades after the trials, the Massachusetts legislature passed a bill reversing the attainders against many of the accused. Families were offered financial compensation. £20 here, 50 there, a small price for a life lost. Some families refused the money, others accepted it quietly, more as recognition of their loved one's innocence than for any material gain. Even then, not all names were cleared. It would take until 2001, over 300 years after the trial, for the state to officially exonerate the last of the accused. The story of Salem became a cautionary tale. For some, it was a warning about the dangers of religious extremism. For others, a lesson in the necessity of due process. Over time, it took on a larger symbolism, not just a historical event, but a mirror reflecting how fear can deform justice. how belief can override reason, and how communities can destroy themselves from within. Writers, historians, and playwrights return to Salem again and again. In the 20th century, Arthur Miller's The Crucible revived interest in the trials, casting them as an allegory for McCarthyism and the Red Scare. Through his lens, the witch hunt became a metaphor for any time when paranoia eclipses truth, when accusation becomes a weapon, and when silence is safer than dissent. And yet, for all the analysis and one truth remains. 20 innocent people died at the hands of their neighbors, and hundreds more were shattered by the weight of suspicion. The trials were not about witches. They were about people. People who lied. People who believed people who were afraid. And people who stayed silent when they should have spoken, though the executions had ceased, and the courts had been reformed. The emotional and spiritual aftermath of the trials would continue to shape New England for generations. The villages that once thrived on interdependence now stood fragmented. Neighbor eyed neighbor with suspicion, and many withdrew from public life altogether, afraid to speak out, afraid to be noticed. Even in households where no direct accusations were made, the atmosphere had changed. Fear had rewritten relationships. Children were taught caution instead of trust. Ministers tread more carefully in their sermons. Court officials became more reluctant to intervene in religious disputes. It was a society that had tasted the poisonous fruit of unchecked righteousness, and now it found itself unsure how to recover. The psychological trauma of the accused cannot be overstated. Those who survived imprisonment often emerged emaciated, sick, and socially hostile. Few spoke openly about their experiences. Some left Salem altogether. Others lived in quiet defiance, clinging to their innocence while their neighbors whispered. And yet, despite the silence, memory persisted. The stories passed from family to family, embedded in the oral traditions of New England. Grandparents told tales of the time when the devil walked among them, or, more truthfully, when fear made monsters out of friends. In some homes, shame buried those memories. In others, they were kept alive as cautionary markers. Over time, the actual location of Gallows Hill was lost. Its place in town, memories slowly eroded. It was not until the late 19th century that historians began earnestly reconstructing the precise events and geography of the trials. Their work uncovered court records, personal letters, and town meeting notes that had long been buried in archive. A clearer picture began to form, one of complexity, nuance, and devastating clarity. Salem became more than just a town. It became a symbol. In the centuries that followed, Salem would be reinvented many times. The town embraced its history, paradoxically turning tragedy into tourism. Museums, walking tours, and reenactments attracted visitors eager to understand, or perhaps just gawk at the scenes of the past. Businesses began using witch iconography. Halloween brought a second harvest to local merchants. The witch became both victim and mascot. But beneath the kitsch lay something real. Each October, as thousands walked the cobblestone streets of Salem, few could escape the knowledge that they stood where justice once failed so profoundly. In cemeteries shaded by old elm trees, the names of the accused marked headstones and memorials, and in quiet corners, descendants of the condemned still laid flowers. For those who study the trials, historians, theologians, legal scholars, the lessons are both ancient and modern. They warn of what happens when ideology overrules evidence, when courts abandon fairness, when public fear becomes public policy, and when courage, though present, comes too late. The Salem Witch Trials were not a singular aberration. They were the product of many forces. Colonial anxiety, religious rigidity, social friction, and a human capacity for projection and blame. In that sense, they belong not only to the past but to every age. When we say never again, we are speaking to Salem, and if we mean it, we must remember what happened there, not with sensationalism, but with sobriety, not with blame, but with understanding. This is the legacy of Salem, a warning carved in silence, waiting for ears willing to hear.